have the controls.
Oh yeah, I'm in control already, just how I like her.
Perhaps this is Dr. Kay Inckle. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll let you introduce yourself.
So thank you very much for inviting me. Hopefully you can see my screen now. Okay, so as Justine said, I'm joining you all the way from Liverpool in the UK. And I suppose before I go any further, I'm just very conscious that this is an international event. So I'd just like to say I'm very sorry about the government of my country, and please don't think that it reflects all of us, because it certainly doesn't. So thank you for not judging me by that. So today what I'm going to be talking about is cycling and disability and the impacts and barriers for people with physical disabilities. And this is based on some research that I did with an organisation called Wheels to Wellbeing, and I really recommend checking out their website after this webinar. They're based in London, but they're a really unique and very powerful cycle campaign group run by and for people with disabilities. So the nature of this project, it's a small scale qualitative research project that we were hoping would be the basis for funding for some wider longitudinal research. And it was looking at the health, identity and social impacts of cycling for people with physical disabilities. So in this part of the research, there were 7 participants, 4 male and 3 female. And as I talk about them and their experiences, I just wanted to reinforce that all the names that I use are pseudonyms, that are not their real names. Their ages range from 31 to 64 years, and that gender balance and age range shows more or less equivalent male and female, and a sort of older age range tends to reflect the overall disabled cycling population as a whole, which tends to have higher female participation and an older age range than able-bodied cyclists. In terms of their employment backgrounds, 6 of the participants were currently or previously employed in white-collar jobs. 2 were retired, 1 on medical grounds in her early 30s and 1 in his early 60s, earlier than he'd intended, but almost close enough to actual retirement age on account of his disability. In terms of their nationality, ethnicity, region, 6 of them were white European and 5 of them were based in the southeast of England. And I was living and working in London at the time that I did this research, which sort of explains that regional focus. It's important to say that this research was specifically about people with physical disabilities. And that's important for a number of reasons. The first is that when people live with a physical disability, one of the first challenges that we encounter is barriers to mobility and to transport. So mobility is one of the key issues that people often suffer with. But there's also really significant barriers to health, exercise and physical activity for people with physical disabilities. And lastly, I talk about physically disabled people because really, in many ways, the term disability as a broad concept is effectively a little bit like a dustbin category. It's just something that we throw a hugely diverse group of the population, everything from people with HIV, cancer, Down syndrome, dyslexia, spinal cord injury, all go into this category of disability, whether or not they have anything in common or encounter similar barriers to social participation. So that's why it's important to understand that these are people who identify as having physical disabilities. Out of the 7, 3 of them rode standard bicycles, so your regular 2-wheel bikes, and with some very minor adaptations to that. And 3 rode non-standard cycles, including a recumbent, a hand cycle and a tricycle, and 1 rode a combination of standard and non-standard cycles. And they had cycling experience between them of between 2 and 50 years, so from quite novice cyclists to people who've been cycling for pretty much all of their lives. So the first thing that the participants reported was how crucial that cycling is to their mobility. It was a form of transport, it was a form of for day-to-day activities as well as things like commuting. And also what people reported was that they found cycling easier and safer than even attempting to walk for those who had got some walking mobility or wheelchair propulsion. And this is certainly borne out by wider research, which emphasises that in particular, wheelchair propulsion over the long term can have a really detrimental impact on shoulder joints because of the kind of motion that's used, whereas hand cycling, because it places more stress on the muscles rather than the shoulder joints, doesn't have that negative impact. But people really talked about the impact on their mobility that cycling had. So Rob said, I do a lot of cycling, actually, despite the fact that I have real problems walking any distance. I do cycle a lot and I cycle quite long distances. So I have no problems cycling with such. I just love cycling. It's a fantastic way for me to get around. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to. And he talked about, you know, in his day-to-day life, he wasn't able to walk more than 50 meters and that walking was really very painful for him. And yet the day before we did the research interview, he'd completed a 111-kilometer cycle ride. So something as simple as a bicycle has a massive impact on the kind of distance he can travel using his own body. Helen, who was a wheelchair user, said before she got her hand cycle, she said, I would never by choice wheel somewhere that's just wheelchair propulsion, unless it's literally round the corner, because that's not a pleasant situation to be in, because the pavements are so rubbish, lack of cut curbs, all of that rubbish. So again, for her, she'd been completely dependent on her car until she got a hand cycle, and she described her cycle as being the equivalent of learning to fly. And then lastly, in terms of the safety element, Rosie was someone who walked with crutches, but she was quite vulnerable on her crutches and had often had problems breaking her limbs. And she said, crutches, I would be more anxious about moving around. I'm worried I'll fall or something. And then on the bike, you don't really worry because you know you're not going to fall. And so Rosie rode a recumbent or she rode a tricycle. So obviously it was 3 wheels and she was stable, and it really is very difficult to fall off a tricycle or a recumbent. So for all of the participants, it was a form of mobility that gave them the opportunity to travel distances that they wouldn't normally be able to, but it was also felt much safer for all of them. So obviously, when you're using a cycle for your mobility, it's also a form of active travel. And this is something that people also talked about, how important cycling was in terms of the physical exercise that it gave them. And for all of the participants, they described cycling as their main form of exercise. And for about half of them, it was the only form of exercise that they ever did. And this is really important because for people with physical disabilities, there are really significant barriers to exercise, particularly cardiovascular exercise. So the kind that gets your heart racing, that gets you breathing faster, that gets the sweat on, and that is really good for your overall health. When you have a physical disability, it can be really hard to access that without specialist equipment or access to a gym. And very often there's infrastructural barriers that prevent people from using that kind of equipment or accessing a gym. And then if they can access a gym, there's very often attitudinal barriers within it. So from the staff in the gym who often, you know, panic when they see a disabled person coming in to use the equipment, or for other gym users. And certainly speaking for myself, you know, I go to a gym fairly regularly. Well, when we're not in lockdown, I do, and I will be minding my own business, carrying weights around that I'm going to use. And without asking, I will often find men leaning into my lap, which I find a very personal space, and trying to lift the weights out of my lap and carry them for me, which is both incredibly intrusive into my personal space, but also incredibly strange in the fact that I've picked those weights up and I'm carrying them because I'm going to work out with them. So, you know, I really don't need any help lifting them. That's the point of me having them. So access to physical cardio-based exercise can be really difficult for people. So everybody talked about how cycling was their main form of access. So Michael said, the other most normal thing that I do, talking about his cycling activities, the highest frequency would be leisure riding on the recumbent. And that's really my kind of gym session, my opportunity to get a proper workout, just to spend a good hour or two getting the heart rate up, getting the breathing up. And yeah, because taking the kids to school, he has a family trike, which he does that on. As much fun as it is, I don't really get much of a sweat on. And again, Nazia used her bike to go to work, but it also had really important health impacts for her. So she said, it's really good for my health. It keeps my weight down. I do it because it does keep my weight down, and it's constant exercise. It's my commute, but it's really good for my exercise. So again, cycling allows disabled people to structure in important cardiovascular exercises into our day-to-day routines, rather than always thinking we have to go somewhere to a special facility or go through the palaver of trying to access specialist equipment in order to exercise. So of course, when we're thinking about exercise, it's good for our physical health. And again, this was something that the participants talked about in all kinds of ways. And in my research, I was not really interested in asking people about how cycling impacted on specific aspects of their disability, but very often people found that cycling allowed them to improve their physical condition in ways that structured physiotherapy did not. So Rosie said, yeah, I do feel my legs muscles getting stronger because my muscle is really bad up here. It's like really weak, and I've done so much physio on it and it just never gets anywhere. Well, it does get, but you know what I mean. But cycling, it does make it a bit stronger. I mean, sometimes when I come back and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so sore, but that's part of it, isn't it? So again, what struck me as really interesting, that cycling was actually helping people to work on parts of their body more effectively than structured physiotherapy was achieving for them. And then Eric talked about how for him, cycling not only helped him cope with his disability, but it also impacted on another long-term health condition. So he said, the other thing with this stroke, I'm not able to walk far at all, and I'm very slow walking, so there's no exercise there. And the thing is, they say to people, if you're not getting enough exercise, it makes you worse and worse and worse. The cargo trikes means I am able to do a full shop, and I am able to get exercise, and I'm getting a lot of exercise. I've got asthma as well, and they said, the asthma nurse said, my lung capacity was improving. It's better than it had been in previous years, which is what you want. So again, it's really interesting that cycling is also starting to impact on long-term health conditions for people that they hadn't found a way to address previously. So the physical health impacts are really significant in all different kinds of ways. But of course, we know that exercise is not just about our physical health. It's also about our mental health. And there is different dimensions to how physical exercise impacts on mental health. And I suppose the first one of these that people talked about was the physiological impact of cardiovascular exercise. So again, it's that mood altering effect that raising the heart rate, that increasing the breathing has. And again, Helen talked about cycling in contrast to physiotherapy, which had been her only previous experience of physical exercise or activity. And she said, what physio never did was actually exercise my heart. Cycling gets my lungs and my heart really pumping and exercising. And again, she and Rob both talked about how important that experience of sort of endorphin release after strenuous exercise was to them in terms of their mood. And Helen said, you know, it was cycling for her was the first time that she'd ever experienced that. And of course, when she'd experienced it once, it was something that she was going to seek out again in future. So it's that whole experience of how mood altering exercise can be, and what a positive experience that is, and that again, that encourages people to seek out that experience again. There were other dimensions to the mental health impacts of cycling, and this was particularly so for people who had acquired disabilities in adult life. And in my research, it was all male participants who had acquired disabilities in adulthood. And again, this tends to fit with the sort of broader picture of people with physical disabilities, that there is a higher proportion of men who acquire a physical disability in their adult life. And of course, this creates not just the physical challenges of learning to live with the barriers that you encounter with a physical disability, but for men, it also faces that challenge of masculinity, given that we define masculinity as sort of epitomised by a body that is strong, powerful, dominant, independent, taking control of others. And our stereotype, although not the reality of disability, is the idea of a body that is weak, dependent, helpless, needy. So men often find them entering an bodily identity that is really counter to their sense of their self as men, or their understanding of their masculinity. So this can have a significant impact on how men encounter physical disability and how they integrate that and how they live with that. And cycling can be a really important part of sort of the recovery, if you like, from the shock of disability, particularly for men who cycled prior to their injury and then were able to continue afterwards. So Michael, one of the participants, he acquired a disability following a motorbike injury, but prior to that he'd been a very physically active, outdoorsy kind of person. So he did fell running, he did off-road mountain biking trials, and when he became disabled, initially he believed that he would never be able to do any of those things again. Following his disability, he was also taking quite a lot of both psychiatric and pain medication to deal with the physical and mental trauma of his injury. But then of his own volition, being a cycling enthusiast, he decided to try out a recumbent cycle, and he realised, as you would have seen on a previous cycle, that actually that was a way that he could get a really, really good workout. And the way that he described that really stuck with me. He described cycling as being better than counselling. And following his taking up of recumbent cycling, he stopped using all of his medication. So he stopped taking both the psychiatric and the pain medication. So it had a really transformative impact for him. Paul also talked about how important cycling was in terms of his reintegrating his identity and his life following becoming disabled. So he said, to my mind, you can go one of two ways if you've had an accident. Obviously, for people who are already disabled, they have grown up with that. But when it's something that happens to you like this, you can go one of two ways. You can sit in a chair and go, oh my goodness, this is terrible, what am I going to do? Or you can try and get on with life. And I think that if you can stay positive and if you could do what you could do before, then that certainly helps. I think if I hadn't had that, i.e. cycling, that would have been a very different story for me. So he really identified being able to cycle after his injury as something that really helped him to get his life back, feel positive about himself and stay active. So there's really significant direct mental health impacts in terms of being able to cycle, both for people who are living with disabilities as a lifelong experience and also for those who acquire disabilities. But there's also something really significant in terms of the broader ideas of mental health and well-being in terms of what cycling can do. And all of the participants talked about how important the kind of autonomy and the self-reliance was that cycling offered to them. So they talked about things like freedom, independence, self-determination, self-reliance. So for example, Nazia said, it's the independence, which I haven't said. I think that's the other thing. You're not relying on transport. You are relying on your own transport. You are relying on yourself. And I think that is a big boost to anybody with a disability. You rely on yourself. And wherever you are, when you're on your bicycle, you can rely on yourself. And wherever you are, you can dictate what you do. No one's dictating to you what you can do. And again, that sense of sort of independence, of autonomy and self-reliance is so rare for people with physical disabilities, because there are so many barriers to autonomy. And again, as I'll come on to in a moment, most of those barriers are not to do with the disability itself, but to do with all of the infrastructure that restricts and limits people. The other point that people made in terms of cycling and wellbeing, and in particular Helen, Rosie and Paul, talked about being able to access nature, being able to be free in the countryside, being able to get out of the city, off the roads, into the parks. And again, of course, we know that nature, being part in the natural world, is really important for our mental health and well-being. And yet again, it can be something that's really hard to access for people who have physical disabilities. Okay, so far that's looking at some of the impacts of cycling for people with disability in terms of mobility, exercise, and the physical and mental health benefits that it creates for people. So in many ways, cycling seems like a win-win, and you know, we might be asking, why don't all physically disabled people cycle? And again, there are a lot of reasons for this, and these are the issues of the kind of barriers that people face. And many of these are infrastructural barriers, so things like cycle paths not being accessible to non-standard cycles. This is something that's a huge problem in Britain. You can see the picture on the screen at the moment. This is one of the pop-up cycle lanes that was introduced by Liverpool City Council just last week in order to try and give people an alternative to public transport because of the pandemic, and that cycle lane is just 1 metre wide, so it's completely useless for anybody who is not cycling a standard two-wheel bicycle. A tricycle, a hand cycle, a recumbent would not be able to use that cycle lane. There are also issues in terms of the quality of the roadways, and I'm just going to flick through these because I have visuals which are much nicer than words. So in terms of things like the issues of road quality, again, which is a significant problem in Liverpool, you can see on the screen a very heavily potholed road. The potholes are so deep in that someone's actually planted flowers in them, which I think is quite sweet. That's not actually Liverpool, but there are certainly many roads where you could probably plant a rose bush in the potholes. They're so deep. We also have cycle infrastructure that again is based on the idea that everybody can dismount from a bicycle, lift it up over a step, change level with it, and so you very often see these sudden end of route dismount signs, which again, if you're a disabled cyclist riding either a standard bicycle or a non-standard cycle, you're completely trapped. You can't do any of the things that route expects you to. There are also, again, something that's happening in Britain at a lot of stations at the moment is these kind of two-tier cycle parking facilities, which require people to be able to lift their bicycle into an overhead stand or to fit it into a very narrow space underneath the overhead stands. Again, a disabled cyclist using either a bicycle or a non-standard bike cannot use any of them. So again, we are effectively prevented from being able to cycle to a station and to use public transport. The next picture you can see, it's a speed hump, so again designed to slow cars down when they're driving through quieter roadways. And again, what you see with these is there's usually a very narrow space on either side of the speed bump, which would allow a two-wheel bicycle to get around that. But again, if you're on a three-wheeler of any description, that's hopeless, and you will end up scraping the bottom of something or getting stuck on a bump like that. And then lastly, you can see the gate. Again, these are very popular in Britain. I don't know if you suffer from them, but these weird kind of half folding gates, which if you're riding a standard bicycle to get through it, you need to dismount, upend your bicycle onto the back wheel, push it through, and then remount your bicycle. So again, if you're a disabled cyclist on a standard bicycle, you can't do that. And if you're on a three-wheeler, a tricycle, a recumbent hand cycle, you cannot get through a gate like that. So again, these really significant infrastructural barriers. The other thing that people talked about was the increasing pedestrianisation of spaces, and again, how pedestrianised spaces are usually ban people from cycling. And while certainly I find as a hand cyclist that people are slow to shout at me for being in the pedestrianised space on a hand cycle because it's obvious I have a disability, for people who might be riding a tricycle, a cargo trike or a standard bicycle, but who can't walk, often experience a lot of hostility and threats from cycling through pedestrianised areas. So there's all these barriers that prevent disabled people from cycling. And these are really significant because if we look at the wider health information that we have about the population as a whole, disabled people have the worst physical and mental health outcomes of any group. We face the biggest barriers to employment, transport, exercise, social participation and leisure. And yet cycling in itself answers so many of these. So again, it's this question of really why is disabled people cycling? Why does that still seem such an anomaly? And why are there so many barriers still remaining? And I suppose if I was to give you a sound bite at this moment, I think the sound bite, the one thing that I'd like you to take away from this is that the barriers to disabled people cycling are never the disability itself. There is pretty much always a way a disabled person can cycle. It is always the structure, the infrastructure, the attitudes and the policy that surround us that prevent disabled people from cycling. And if I was feeling very bold, I might add to that soundbite that the problem of disability is never the disability itself. The problem of disability is very often able-bodied people and the kind of world that they produce. Okay, enough soundbites and back to barriers. So some of the other barriers that people face are in terms of the kind of costs and resources to cycle, particularly if you're cycling a non-standard cycle or require adaptations to a bicycle. That can be very expensive. A non-standard cycle, certainly in Britain, can cost at least 10 times as much as a standard bicycle. And this happens in a context where there's a massive employment and income gap for disabled people. So you have like hugely inflated costs of the equipment you need for people who are struggling with really reduced incomes. And then there's always also an issue of storage. And again, this is something that people talked about, and I think it was particularly pertinent because a lot of the participants were living in London. But where people live in very dense old housing accommodation, there's very often an issue about where will people store a cycle, particularly a non-standard cycle. So there have been adaptations made to these kind of on-street parking sort of modules that you can see in the picture. But again, they are only designed to accommodate a standard bicycle rather than any kind of non-standard cycle. There are also attitudinal barriers, and again, these vary depending on whether someone has a visible disability or an invisible disability. But all of them emerge from the idea that there is a complete opposition between physical disability and physical activity. So if you are cycling, you can't be disabled, and if you are disabled, you can't cycle. And this means that when disabled people do cycle, if they have a visible disability, there's often a kind of overt hostility towards people. So Rosie talked about an experience she had where she was participating in an inclusive cycling activity in a public park, and she said there was this guy actually in the park where we did it the other day, and he was just like shouting over at me, and I was really concerned. Oh, what does he want? Now it turns out it was nothing threatening, it wasn't hostile. But again, speaking for myself, there is certainly an experience that if you are a visibly disabled person cycling, you will never go out and not be the subject of people commenting, pointing, waving, shouting things at you. And again, people very often mean well, but you know, if you just want to go home from work or do shopping, you don't necessarily want to attract all this kind of attention. But sometimes the attention can be very overtly hostile. Michael had one of the worst experiences of all the participants. He said, I have had cause to speak to the police just once about getting shouted at by some builders. And the reason I went and spoke to the police is I don't want my kids to have to put up with this or see this kind of behaviour. So he talked about them sort of shouting really disableist, threatening abuse at him. And because he also cycled with his kids, he was not just frightened for his own safety, but also frightened for his kids seeing him being threatened in that way. There are a different set of attitudinal barriers for people who have so-called hidden disabilities that might ride a standard bicycle, but might find it very difficult to walk. So again, when people were using their bicycle as their mobility aid, they talked about the kind of challenges and hostility that they encountered in public. So Nazia said, I don't get off the bike, so this is in a no cycling area. I just scoot. I use one leg and I'm on a pedestrian area, and everyone just looks at you like, get off your bike. And I'm thinking like, well, it's actually easier for me just to do that than to get off and push it. So Nazia finds it really difficult to walk with her bicycle. She says, you do get people looking at you going, why are you doing that? You know, and you just take it. If people say something, I just say, I can't walk, or I find it difficult to walk, and I carry on. And Rob also talked about similar experiences. He said people just see the bicycle and that's all they see, despite the fact they can obviously see that I have problems walking. They will ask me to get off and walk in various places, or they won't allow me into, for example, parks. So there's this constant kind of tension around being a disabled person and cycling. And there's really significant emotional impacts to this, as well as the obvious exclusion from public space and social participation that the direct prevention of being able to cycle in, for example, a park. But the participants talked about the ongoing impact of these kind of encounters when they were using their cycle. So Nazia said, I sort of get annoyed and I sort of think about it for a while and I think, actually, no, I will just carry on. You get angry, you know, when anyone says it, that you can't do something. You explain it to them that this is what I'm going to do, but I just carry on. I do carry on, but you think about it. That's what I do. I think about it more than I should. And Rob said, there is a sense all the time that you're thinking, how are people looking at me here? Because I'm quite sensitive. I like to think that I'm not irritating people, but I find that quite often I am when I'm on my bike because of their expectations and their preconceptions about what I should be doing. Yeah, it is. It's wearing. It's quite wearing to have to think about this every time that I go out. And again, I just sort of ask any able-bodied people that are listening to just sort of pause for a moment and just reflect on what it might be like to have to consider every time that you go out in public that you're going to get stared at, pointed at, people are going to be cross with you or challenge you simply because of the way that you're trying to move space and achieve mobility for yourself, and what kind of encounter with the outside world that creates on a daily basis. Okay, one more barrier and then I shall wrap up. So the last barrier to cycling for disabled people, surprisingly or not, depending on your experience of health professionals, is health professionals. So all of the participants in the research only discovered cycling by chance. They were never pointed by any kind of health professional to the possibility that they can cycle. So for example, Rob said, no, never, no. It's definitely something that I discovered for myself, and it kind of evolved in a way. Yeah, it just, nobody ever said that cycling might be an option for you. It was just something I found myself. Rosie said, no, only on the exercise bike, but not ever as cycling. I didn't know. I had no clue whatsoever that there was inclusive cycling. And I think what is even more significant about this is even when disabled people, as part of their physiotherapy or part of their rehabilitation after an injury, are being encouraged to use static cycle machines in a gym, be that hand cycle or a leg cycle machine, none of those health professionals are ever saying there are ways you can turn this into transport and mobility. No one ever suggests to them that you might like a hand cycle or a recumbent and then you can use this to get around. So Helen said, there was a period of time when I got quite a bit of support through a neurophysiotherapy gym, And they had got a static bike that they put you in front of to get your legs, its legs, and it does have arm things. So she was explaining it's a hand on a leg cycle machine. And that was brilliant. It was really good. I could get my legs moving using muscles that I don't normally use, but I saw it as physio. Nobody then said, oh, how about looking at this as a mode of transport or as fun or as exercise? And again, I just think this is such a huge chasmous flaw in the whole system, that we have health professionals sticking people in sort of sterile, smelly gyms to use a static machine, rather than saying, there's a place you can borrow a trike or a hand cycle from, go and cycle through the park. This could be a completely transformative form of transport of freedom for you. Okay. To summarise then, so cycling is easier and safer than walking and wheelchair propulsion for people with physical disabilities. It's an essential form of mobility, of social participation and cardiovascular exercise, and it's key to physical and mental health and well-being. Obviously, it's also key to sustainability, something that I haven't really talked about, that again, given the climate crisis that the whole planet is facing, we really need to be getting everybody away from carbon burning transport and into things like cycling that have zero impact on the environment. But notwithstanding all of these, there is significant barriers to cycling for people with disabilities. But these are not disability related. This is not about the disability itself. It's about infrastructure, policy, finances, health professionals, economic barriers, and so on and so on. And that really all of these seem to be underpinned by this sort of very binary understanding of what physical disability is, that if you are disabled, you are completely physically incapable of everything, and therefore you will not be participating in any physical activity, and certainly not cycling. And then that creates a system where cycle infrastructure doesn't accommodate disabled people, so disabled people don't cycle. And so it completely reinforces itself. Okay, that's the end of my presentation from now. So I will remove my screen share and hand you back to Justine.
Thank you so much, Kay. I think as an able-bodied person, it definitely takes more thinking on my part to when I look out like on the street and I see folks on like recumbent cycles, and just like how much extra work it goes into just like getting mobile when it's just so second nature for so many able-bodied folks. So we really appreciate your presentation and your opinion. If folks check the handout section of the control panel, you can access the very research project that Kay was talking about. You can download it, and we also have links to her book that she wrote. So now I'm going to be introducing Christopher Rajala. Christopher is a software developer who works at UVic and other local organizations to find technical solutions to barriers that people with disabilities face. Today he will be speaking about his platform on computers that give opportunities for those, and the opportunities they give to give us to improve accessibility. Oh, geez. Christopher, I'll give it over to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm coming to you live from the Assistive Technology Lab at the University of Victoria today. And as Justine said, I'm going to be sharing some interesting technology that we've been using on a robot project here to address some quality of life issues for some people with disabilities. So it's going to be a bit of a change of pace from the last presentation. I'm going to kind of go rapid fire on a bunch of different types of technologies here, just to give you hopefully some ideas of the technology that's available to all of us today to overcome even some complicated issues that would have been absolutely impossible to address not too long ago. So the James the Robotic Butler is the name of the project that we've been working on here, and it was born out of a need for a camera system that could be operated by somebody with physical disabilities. Our first user, James, had a rare skin condition that restricted his ability to use his hands and a camera. And we implemented an iPad control mechanism for a camera. Sorry, just to interrupt. Kay, could you mute your microphone, please? Thank you. Our second client, Will, has only the use of his voice to be able to control the camera. So throughout this entire project's life, we've had to really focus on how much UI or user interface is actually necessary in order to be able to get people to use this camera. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the bottom here and show you. This is, it's on top of a dolly, but this module right here is the base, and there's wheels underneath, and that is effectively the legs of the robot. So our robot doesn't look like a human. It's not designed to look like a human. It might be useful to think of this as a automatic driving car, simply a place where we can put things on and have this be able to move around a space intelligently through the use of some really interesting technology. First and foremost, inside the computers on this is something called the Robot Operating System, or ROS for short, which is open source software, which means that anybody can use it and modify it freely. And it is turning out to be very powerful for projects like this, projects that use multiple different types of technologies coming together inside of the robot operating system to kind of synthesize the robot's life. We have a series of cameras and sensors on this device here. Inside, we've got cameras which operate on more than just the visual field. So they have additional sensors built in, like infrared and lasers, so that what we can get inside of the computer is an extremely detailed picture of the environment that the robot's in. And this allows it to navigate in places where there are moving objects and things around it, a dynamic environment that these cameras allow it to safely navigate. In addition to that, you'll notice on the outside of this it is 3D printed. So the outside of this robot is all very clean and safe. It can actually bump into things and it's not going to affect and damage the equipment inside. And that's something that modern technology lets us do, is design and print this sort of structure in-house. And in the not too recent past, that would be extremely expensive to do, to have plastic components that we can design and put together like this. Now, moving up the platform, this sits on top of our mobile platform. And this is the arm, or you could think of it as a crane. So this is a lift that's controlled by microcomputers that live in here. And it houses a gimbal with the camera on top. So what's interesting here is our use of precision step controlled motors. So this is a motor just like the motor in your car in some regards, except what we have now is the ability to control these into very, very minute detail. So up on the gimbal itself, we have 3 of these, and they allow the articulation of the camera to a very, very precise degree. And used in conjunction with the zoom on the camera and the ability to move the entire platform around from the base device, you can kind of see that we are able to overcome the ability of somebody not being able to handle and move that camera. Now, the camera itself is a Canon camera, which is just over the last year or two, we've been able to access the software on the camera ourselves as developers. So Canon has intentionally opened up the camera to our Wi-Fi systems, and we can take over the control of it through digital systems as if we were touching the camera. So all of the different functionality, adjusting the zoom, adjusting the lens, taking the photo, adjusting the different parameters, lights, aperture size, all of it we can do with our final piece of the puzzle, an iPad. And we use this for a few different reasons. One of the most important reasons, which you're all quite familiar with, is Siri, or if you're familiar with another platform, voice to text. So the ability for these modern devices to use a voice and turn it into digital text is what allows this robot to be controlled by anybody. We design apps and we design interfaces for individuals who have different needs. So for instance, James, he did have the ability to use his hands on the device a little bit. So some buttons and sliders there would be able to improve the speed at which he was able to take his photos. However, Will doesn't have that ability to touch the screen, so he has to entirely use his voice. And with the Apple development platform, as well as the really, really powerful hardware that we get with these small devices, we can do the voice to text and then send commands to the camera, as well as to the gimbal and the lift and the mobile station, and allows us to have complete control over the entire robot just through voice commands. Yeah, and that's my rapid fire rundown of my favorite technologies that are incorporated into our robot.
Thanks so much, Christopher. We have one more presentation. I would like to introduce Kristi Owens, who works with Cycling Without Age, and she'll be presenting on how the organization works with folks with disabilities and with seniors. When she rides her bike, she likes to find little shortcuts that are only accessible by bike. Kristi, I will turn the controls over to you so you can share your screen. Just one moment.
Great, thanks, Justine. I have a PowerPoint that I'm just going to open up here. Great. Thanks to Justine and Bike to Work Society for inviting me to present in this webinar. I'm finding it really inspiring listening to the last two. My name is Kristi Owens, and I'm co-founder of Cycling Without Age Victoria. I want to introduce you to a program that I helped start here in Victoria called Cycling Without Age, and also tell a couple of stories on how bikes can be a great tool. I think we already have a pretty good idea of that from the last presentations, but we might find a few nuggets in here. So me and two partners heard about this awesome sounding program happening overseas called Cycling Without Age. And the essence of the program is volunteers take elderly and less mobile people out on bike rides in this specially designed bike that you can see in the picture. You notice there's room for two people in front, or in this case, someone and a dog, and the seats in the front. And that's what, so it's got what we like to call a VIP front row pass to nature, scenery, and the community. Cycling Without Age is the brainchild of Ole Kassow. He came up with the concept in Copenhagen in 2012. And because he always used to pass this elderly gentleman sitting on a bench in the sun, he thought, I wonder if he'd like to go for a bike ride. I bet he used to ride and he might miss it. So he asked Thorkel, the gentleman, and he said, yes, he would like to go for a bike ride. And since then, it's become a huge global phenomenon with 2,200 chapters in 50 countries around the world. The Victoria chapter got our first bike in 2017. We have 3 bikes now and about 25 volunteers and have done hundreds of rides. The program's operating out of 2 care homes in Victoria, so if anyone's interested or has more questions, I've left links with Justine to their volunteer pages. Even though our passengers aren't actually doing the pedaling, I believe that they're still getting most of the benefits. Like easily being able to widen their radius. Kay talked about this. We can get so much further on the bike than if we're being pushed in a wheelchair or operating it ourselves, or walking maybe with a walker. But the bike still stays at a speed where we can easily stop and visit with a neighbor, or like smell some flowers or pet a dog. Another benefit is spending time outside, getting that satisfyingly tired feeling of spending the day outdoors, you know, in all sorts of weather. As you can see, there's a picture on the screen of them pedaling in Iceland in the snow. It's energizing and it's nice. It makes going back inside more appealing. It's like the après-ski. I think of, you know, the lodge wouldn't be so cozy if you hadn't spent the day outside on the slopes. And another benefit is that the bike often replaces a wheelchair or walker. So suddenly the world looks at us differently. I think Kay illustrated this beautifully. The word demedicalized means the process by which a behavior or condition, once labeled sick, becomes defined as natural or normal. So now we're just people out for a bike ride. We're somebody's granny petting a dog, or like in the picture, we're having a glass of wine with a friend. One of the volunteers told me the story about taking a passenger up to Maddox Farm on this bike. The passenger is wheelchair bound and they live at a care home. So the staff used the mechanical lift to lift them from the wheelchair, lift her from the wheelchair and strapped her into the bike. And they started out on the bike path near Swan Lake. It was a sunny, hot day and they rode along the Lochside Trail. They stopped at Blenkinsop Lake Bridge and fed the ducks. And some of you probably know this ride. You know, it goes along the bike path and then it goes through the quiet neighborhood and there's some nice ocean views and nice houses. So it's pretty spectacular, especially in contrast to spending most of your time at a care facility. And it's a pretty ambitious ride and it was a hot day. So once they got out to Maddox Farm, they sat in the sun and enjoyed an ice cream cone. And when they were sitting there, people started coming up and, you know, asking them about the bike because it's sort of big and red and it's a natural conversation starter. This day went down in history for the two of them. You know, they had a great time just sitting in the sun, chatting with all the people coming up to visit and eating their ice cream. Another day that stands out is the time I took Jill on a little library book tour. Jill is a total mystery book fan. And one time when I was sitting with her at the care home, she told me she was having to read really slowly because she was running out of books and they're really difficult for her to get. It was hard for her to get to the library logistically. So we made a plan to spend the day going out to all the little library boxes in the neighborhood on the bike. It was cool because we could like ride right up to the box, open up the door, and she could pick out the book she wanted. And we could also go to all of them. James Bay has 10 little library boxes and we went to all of them. And, you know, they each have their own personality. One was painted like an angel and another one looked like a little log cabin. So that was fun. And Jill's also a total dog lover, so she carries dog treats. And we were feeding and petting all the passing dogs and a couple of them jumped right up into her lap. And when we were heading home, she said she was looking forward to curling up with a cup of tea and her new books. Now I'll just wrap up. This is the part where I give my appreciation to Bike to Work Society and all their advocacy work, because honestly, I don't think we could run this program without good cycling infrastructure. Our passengers place a lot of trust in the people doing the pedaling. So having separated bike lanes and wide, safe places is really important. Before the Wharf Street bike lane was built, we couldn't cross downtown because we couldn't get back to James Bay on a safe path. And right now we're really excited about being able to hopefully soon use the Dallas Road bike path. That's going to be like a game changer for us. It'll link up everything. So I'd like to wrap up by thanking Kay for her enlightening presentation and Christopher for his ingenious innovation. And thanks again to Justine and Bike to Work Society for inviting me to showcase cycling without age here today. Back to you, Justine.
Thank you very much, Kristi. I found out about Cycling Without Age a few years ago, and I think it's a great program, and I think it's really useful, and it's really great to know that it's also part of Victoria's community here. We have a couple questions. If folks want to stick around, that'd be great. We're ahead of schedule, actually, so I'm pleased about that. So, and I would like to thank each of you, Kay, Christopher, and Kristi, for joining me today. I've learned a lot, and I have some questions as well. So from folks, we have, so basically, folks have typed in their questions, and I'm going to read them out, and I guess I'll just direct them at whoever they are directed to. So we have a question for Kay. Says, my husband is waiting desperately for a knee replacement. Cycling is the only form of activity available to him these days. Even cycling started causing him pain. He, like others Dr. Inckle described, is reluctant to walk and bike when transitioning from bike trails to no cycling allowed areas. Dr. Inckle, do you have any recommendations for how to address the sometimes competing objectives of keeping pedestrians safe, also considered vulnerable users of a trail, by controlling cyclist speed and removing barriers to those with disabilities visible and hidden?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think a lot of the answer to that is cultural. So I was in Holland. I'm in a weird time zone now because we've been in lockdown for 3 months, so I don't even know what year it is. So I think it was last year anyway. And what was really interesting about Holland is that there are shared pedestrian and cycleways all over the place. And it's completely normal to see people whizzing by on, you know, some techie racing bike, someone going past with a tricycle with their dog in the back, a hand cyclist, a tandem, a family out with kids, people walking using walkers, people jogging. And it seems like all it takes is just the recognition that the faster you are, the more you defer to other people. So the more you take account of other people who might be slower, who might not have the physical capacity that you have. And it really interests me because in Britain, there is a massive conflict between one of the reasons they say that lots of cycle lanes are made inaccessible with these strange gates and things is because they don't want people whizzing up and down them or using motocross, and people hate shared pedestrian and cycle spaces because it's this fear of everybody getting run over. And it's just basic courtesy. It's the bigger and faster you are, the more you take other people into account. And if everybody does that, from the car driver to the racing cyclist, to the tricyclist, to the child on the hand cycle, to someone walking with a walking aid, then it's all perfect. So I think it seems to me like it's just cultural. And I think that's the answer to so many things in the world at the moment. It's just about how we think and moving away from this constant me, I need, I'm going to take, and thinking about, you know, with one planet, and we need to kind of share it as best we can without destroying it. And that involves thinking about everybody else. And I mean, I do sometimes cycle on the pavement. I tend to try and avoid doing that, but if I am doing that, I'm always very aware that I'm on a big, fairly fast, heavy hand cycle. And so of course I always give priority to other people, and that just goes without saying. And again, I think it's just cultural and educational. And then we could have beautiful spaces for everybody to use without any issues at all.
I think a lot of what's in Victoria for our new cycling infrastructure, it's labeled as like available for all ages and accessibility, or all ages and abilities. But from my experience, they're quite narrow. And Kristi as well, I was wondering, you mentioned that the Warp Street cycle lane has made it easier with your bikes, but do you find that it's wide enough?
Sorry, excuse me. It is wide enough, but we haven't encountered another tri-shock coming the other way on it yet. So I don't think we would fit. And I think sometimes the pedicabs go in there too. And I know we wouldn't fit. So we'd probably have to do some backing up and maneuvering. So yeah, it's fine for us for one way, but we haven't encountered another one yet. And it definitely wouldn't be wide enough then. But, you know, we're wide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder, like when planners are putting in like infrastructure like this, like if that actually does come up in conversation, it'd be interesting to be at one of those meetings.
Yeah, there is actually something that's been implemented in London that's called the London Cycle Standard, I think. And that's based on all cycle infrastructure being designed to accommodate the biggest imaginable cycles. So I think it's something like a hand cycle, family cargo trike or something. So the biggest thing you can imagine, wide, huge turning circle. And they design everything to make it easy for cycles like that to use it. And they have so they have different direction traffic paths, because obviously there is that issue if you've got two very wide cycles. So it's separate lanes for each direction. So it comes away from that problem of two very large cycles having to pass. But part of what is in that design standard is that a standard cycle at least would also be able to pass a larger, slower cycle like that. So there is actually a design standard there. It's not something that's even implemented nationally in Britain, but it is available. And the other thing that people have started doing again in London is what they call mini Holland schemes, and that's where everything is more or less pedestrianised. There might be some vehicles allowed to go through, but again, instead of having the idea that it's the pavement that has to drop down to the road, everything is level, and there are other ways of restricting cars. So again, there isn't the problem about you've either got a curb or a bollard barrier between the cycleway and the roadway. Everything is designed as an accessible cycle, walking, wheeling space, and then it's the road that's inconvenienced. And again, that seems a much more logical way of doing it, in that if you're in a car, you can sort of, you know, the possibilities of what you can do and how far you can go are so much different to the inconvenience of being made to hop on and off curbs if you're a pedestrian or a cyclist or a wheelchair user. So again, it's kind of like that turnaround of thinking of who are we prioritising.
That's so interesting. I wonder if there's anything like that over here in Canada, like so-called the London Cycle Standard.
Yeah, the London Cycle Design Standard. And if you look at anything about mini Hollands, again, there's a number of boroughs in London that have done them, and I think there's one in Oxford as well now. So again, it's just everything is completely level.
That's so cool. See if I have any more questions. I'm not sure who this is directed at, but someone asked, does NACTO include these accessibility considerations in bike design? Does anyone have? I'm sorry, Glynis, I don't know who you're hoping to ask that question to.
Could I just ask, what is NACTO?
Yeah, I'm not sure either. Glynis, if you're still here. Oh, National Association of City Transportation Officials. I'm not Sure.
I don't know, but it would be great if the person that knows of this organisation could send them some links. So there's the London Cycle Design Standard and the organisation Wheels for Wellbeing, who I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. They've also got their own inclusive cycle design guide that you can download as a PDF. And it's kind of, the London Cycle Design Standard is very big and technical, but the inclusive cycle guide is about 12-page, nice illustrated document. So if the person that knows the NACTO wanted to download and send that to them, that would be great, because things like that can really make a difference.
I also know that whoever designs the AAA, like the all ages and accessibility road design, has also a book as well, and that's probably I know it's based in North America, but I know they do talk about just like different folks with like diverse backgrounds and things as well. So that could be a good resource, but I don't know, our cycle lanes are AAA and they don't seem to fully encapsulate every road user. That's a good place to start. Christopher, I was wondering, just myself, are you hoping to get this software that you're working on kind of more like mass produced? Like, is it a plan to, I know you work with, you said you worked with like 2 young people with disabilities, but are you hoping to make it more, I don't know, more readily available?
Well, currently the app that we wrote for the iPad is available for free on the App Store. And it can be used to control this type of Canon camera. Moving forward, we would like to be able to expand the number of cameras that it can sort of cater to, and hopefully as well include the portions of the software for controlling the base station and controlling the arm. Currently, all my app does is give you the ability to control the camera itself and all the different functionality of the camera. But so that's online. In fact, I can provide a link in, I'll throw it in the chat here, a link to the app in case anybody has an iPad and a Canon camera and would like to play around with controlling it with their voice. And feel free to hit me up with any feedback, or if anybody has any questions about all the different things I threw at you. The reason I did that is because they're can be used in so many different ways, and getting it out to people, getting information about the latest, greatest stuff we're working on is a really great way for us to get new ideas and stuff that people hadn't thought of before, because we didn't have this sort of technology around ever before, and it's all coming so rapidly. So yeah.
I'll be sharing links and things to all of our presenters' projects as well in a follow-up email. So Christopher, if you want to send that to me, then I can send it around to all the participants. If there's any other questions, folks, like, feel free to type them in. For now, it looks like that's all we've gotten from other folks. I might take this opportunity to do a quick showcase of what's going on over at the Bike to Work Society. So I've written down all of our presenters' emails over here, and I hope that folks who have more questions can direct them either to myself or to our presenters themselves. Next week, we're going to be doing a presentation with our bike skills instructors, and they will be going over specific intersections in Greater Victoria that cyclists have challenges on. So if you have ideas of, you come to an intersection that you just have no idea how to cross it as a cyclist or as a pedestrian, this could be a really great opportunity for you to bring some ideas. Also, I would like to talk about our neighborhood scavenger hunts and our neighborhood rides programs that we've just started this summer, which allows folks to download neighborhood-specific questionnaires, and they can take their bikes out, and you can be socially distanced and hang with friends and find out some great information and history about your neighborhoods or other neighborhoods. And there's also prizes to be won. I also hope that folks check out our resource library, which I will be posting also some information from this webinar. And that is just like helpful tips and articles that basically any cyclist or pedestrian would find interesting. And I hope that you check out our website today. That's bike2workvictoria.ca. And if you go to our online cycling resources, then you'll be able to find both the resource library and all of our past and future webinars that are coming up. And you can become a member of our society. You can donate to our society. There's so many great opportunities. And I'm so glad that folks showed up today, because this is a really special presentation. And I'm just so glad that we had all of our speakers today, and I definitely learned quite a bit. And I hope that folks have more questions. And I don't know if any of our speakers have any last things that they want to say. We have some more time, so we can keep going, or we can close down soon if we like.
Sure, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody giving me the platform, and public service announcement to any local riders: be really careful at Cook Street and Pandora. I just saw that tricky intersections link on that page you showed, and that is a tricky one, and I've just about gotten hit there a bunch of times. You got to be really careful at Cook and Pandora.
I'll write that one down. Well, if there's no more things to say, then I would like to say thank you again. I think we can maybe stop the webinar here. Kristi, Christopher, and Kay, thank you very, very much again. And thank you all for coming to our webinar today. There'll be more, and we'll see everyone cycling out there.
Thanks so much, Justine. Really appreciate it. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.